Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant doctor and psychiatrist, and I'm based in private clinical practice in Harley Street in central London in the United Kingdom. I like using world news events and analysing them and seeing how they may help the rest of us deal with the difficulties of life. I believe a lot of the stress of life comes down to having to deal with difficult people. Difficult people in our lives. It could be a difficult spouse or a difficult boss or a difficult sibling or a difficult friend end up in affluent Western societies causing more stress than practically anything else. Obviously, there are many other difficulties in life, like difficult diseases or terrible life events and car crashes and so on. But generally speaking, the everyday strain of modern life boils down to difficult people and how to deal with difficult people. And analysing Donald Trump is, in my humble opinion, a great way of trying to understand how we can learn something about the best way to deal with difficult people. The recent event that's grabbed the news headlines around the world is the latest of what's been called the latest Oval Office ambush. Cyril Ramaphosa, the leader of South Africa, found himself, the world press would say, in the middle of yet another ambush in the Oval Office, where he was invited as a guest and had an entourage with him, including two South African world-class golfers and South Africa's richest man. Yet, despite all the reinforcements he'd brought with him, Cyril Ramaphosa found himself still ambushed by Donald Trump in the Oval Office. This was an extraordinary event. It replicates to some extent what happened when Zelensky visited, so much so that it is said that Cyril Ramaphosa was Zelenskied. Now, given that Donald Trump is conducting diplomacy in really an unprecedented and extraordinary manner, one of the questions that arises whenever someone does something very differently to how everyone thinks it's meant to be done, like having guests in the White House, world leaders, and entertaining them and engaging in diplomacy with them, Donald Trump is doing this in a way that it's never been done like this before. A central question arises when people start to do something very differently. Are they doing it very differently through careful analysis and they're being very clever, and as a result of being more intelligent maybe than the way other people have been in the past, they've come up with a new analysis, a more profound analysis, and as a result of that, they do things differently. This is doing differently by design because you're maybe cleverer than people who came before you. However, there is another basic category as to why some people do things very differently in an unprecedented way, and to put it bluntly, that's because maybe they're unhinged. They're not well psychiatrically. They're seriously ill, and as a result, they do chaotic and unexpected things. There's something certainly very unexpected about the way world leaders repeatedly are finding themselves encountering difficulties in the Oval Office, often orchestrated by President Donald Trump. So one of the central questions which we can address that arises out of the latest Oval Office ambush of Cyril Ramaphosa is, does this tell us that Trump is some kind of genius, or is he a bit mad? The other reason I'd like to analyse this so-called ambush in the Oval Office is I think that engaging with difficulty, if you were to encounter a difficult person like Donald Trump in everyday life, it is highly unlikely the encounter would occur again and again in the way that it's happening at the moment in the Oval Office. Given what's happening to world leaders and, frankly speaking, the humiliation that many of them are experiencing, most times that experience wouldn't repeat because people would just stop coming. But Donald Trump is in such a uniquely powerful position, and the USA, as the world's biggest economy, is in such a uniquely powerful position, and also the USA spends more in arms and military equipment than the rest of the world put together. This all adds up to the fact that no matter how bad a drubbing you may get, or how humiliating the experience of being in the Oval Office might be, it is still the case you've got to turn up. So there's something psychologically really interesting about the fact the trap is sprung, but people have to step into the trap again and again. They just can't not turn up. So the repetitive nature of that very difficult and interesting and intriguing and extraordinary encounter, the fact it repeats again and again, is interesting psychiatrically and psychologically, and gives us an opportunity to perform an in-depth analysis that may not be possible if it was an event that just was a one-off. So I'm going to analyze the event from a psychological standpoint and come up with, I hope you will consider, a somewhat surprising and unexpected analysis. But I'm also going to use it as a tool to think about how to deal with difficult people. Now, the world leaders that are turning up have been briefed by public relations experts, undoubtedly by behavioral experts, perhaps psychologists and psychiatrists, so they arrive armed to the teeth with background scripts and briefing on how to handle Donald Trump. Well, how are they doing? Frankly speaking, not very well. And whether you may like him or loathe him, Donald Trump is doing one great service, which is he's exposing the deep weakness at the heart of world politics, which is over and over again we're seeing these people, Carney, Zelensky, Starmer, etc., Macron, coming over, that despite all their briefings, when they have to think on their feet, they really don't do very well. So Trump is exposing the veneer, the surface public relations thing, that when you go underneath it, because the great thing about Trump, when he delivers the unexpected you can't prepare for. No matter what the briefings have occurred and the training you've had in front of cameras where you've gone over and over again all the possible things that can happen, you arrive in the Oval Office and something completely unexpected occurs, in which case you really are left on your own resources, exposed. And that exposure has not been a pretty picture in terms of other world leaders turning up in the Oval Office. And to some extent, like him or loathe him, I think Trump is doing us a service in exposing some of the great weakness and vulnerability behind all the public relations artifice that we see in world politics. So I think that's one of the attractive things about Donald Trump, which is that some people feel there's a sense in which he brings an authenticity to the office that we haven't seen before. And the fact that the ambush, and the ambush is often, remember, the psychology of an ambush is it has to be done fast, and therefore there has to be a big element of surprise. He actually conducts these ambushes really rather well. Because he does them so quickly. For example, he turns on a dime, and that may be because his mood is unstable and he can get, it seems, pretty irritated and angry very quickly. He's quite, it seems to be an explosive and irritable character. The fact that the element of surprise means that something unexpected happens very quickly is really intriguing psychologically in terms of the test it puts other world leaders to, and they're not doing rather well in terms of the test. So the speed at which Trump springs his surprises is really rather impressive. In the Oval Office ambush, the latest one with Cyril Ramaphosa, it begins with the famous phrase, now, I think it's the most terrifying words in the English language, now, after what we've seen, is Natalie here? Because Natalie is the one that produces the printouts and turns on the video. He says, dim the lights, and someone behind the scenes, it seems to be Natalie, makes things happen, and then bang, you're in the ambush. And certainly world leaders seem trapped in the headlights in that situation. So the psychology of an ambush requires speed. It also requires a lot of pre-planning, and carefully some thought has gone into, well, at least Natalie's thought about it. And that is interesting psychologically, because a straight stand-up fight between two military forces doesn't require as much forethought as an ambush. Certainly, the possibility of an ambush, and we've been here before with Zelensky, is making people nervous. And you can see that these world leaders are nervous. And one of the ways they deal with nerves is to bring an increasingly large entourage with them, backup, reinforcements. And Cyril Ramaphosa had done a bit of thinking about this, let's be fair to the man. He knew that Trump loves golf, so he brought two world-class South African golfers. Unfortunately, he invoked them in the famous moment at which things turned on a dime and it all went dark. And the thing that happened that I think then irritated Trump, which then led to the ambush. So we get into the press conference, and there's a bit of a hint that genocide of white people in South Africa is going to come up. There's almost a sense in which, because Trump does mention it very early on, and then minutes go by where other things happen, that you can almost see him placing the branches and the grass over the bear trap. But maybe the entourage and Cyril Ramaphosa are too nervous or distracted. He does smile rather benignly throughout the press conference, which is a new tactic, to see the bear trap being laid by Trump. So whatever you do have to pay full attention when you're dealing with difficult people. And I do think that the nerves of the world leaders and the fact they're so often brief means they're not often paying full attention. You can see this. You can see them looking around the room, looking at their entourage for support or guidance. And they're not really paying a lot of attention to Trump and looking at him enough. They're looking around the room too much. So one tip when dealing with difficult people is pay attention, be focused. Try to get on board with whatever is going on and try to anticipate what's going to happen next. One of the correspondents says to Trump, what will it take you, and I'm paraphrasing here, to be convinced there is no genocide of white people going on in South Africa? Trump pauses. This pause is very significant because by now you should realize that when Trump pauses and therefore appears lost for words, this is not a good moment. Cyril Ramaphosa, very interestingly, maybe because he's nervous, leaps in and fills the silence and says something like, I'm paraphrasing again, if I could just speak on behalf of the president. At this moment, most psychologists and psychiatrists watching this dived behind the sofa for cover because we knew this was not going to end well. The temerity of Cyril Ramaphosa stepping in and saying, if I can just speak on behalf of the president. This was a very brave move, if somewhat foolhardy. And so he fills the silence. I want to pause here and just talk about filling the silence because I think this is deeply important psychologically. Try to resist filling the silence if you can, because silence is a very powerful technique in negotiation. And Trump is the author of The Art of the Deal. If things go quiet, don't feel that you nervously have to fill the silence, because often that will end disastrously. There was a very famous therapist at the Bethlem Royal and Hospitals, the top postgraduate hospitals in Britain, if not in Europe, maybe the world even, and I was a consultant there for a while. There was this famous therapist, and there's some, blurry black and white videos from back in the day when he was filmed, and the video was used as a teaching exercise for young doctors, which is why I saw it. I actually met the guy. He shall remain nameless, given what I'm about to tell you about him. So this guy took the power of silence to the ultimate extreme. He was a therapist. He worked at the hospital. Patients would walk into the room, new patients, never met him before. They would say, hello, pleased to meet you, my name is so-and-so. The guy would stay silent completely throughout the whole consultation. No introduction, didn't say a single thing. You could see in the video the patients are bewildered. I mean, they'd signed up to the video being made as a teaching exercise. They didn't know what was coming next. They're bewildered, and they look around the room. They're trying to think what's going on here. And they nervously fill the silence. And in filling the silence, because they're uncertain as to what they're meant to say or do, they begin to reveal things about themselves, because they project onto the silence an idea that actually the therapist knows that what they're saying isn't the truth. So they start off with telling stories which are not entirely the truth. All they get back is silence, and they get a sense that maybe they've been spotted for not telling the truth. So eventually they reveal and reveal and reveal and reveal things they've never ever revealed before to anyone. And that's just the power of silence in action. So one tip we should take away is be careful about filling the silence. Ramaphosa fills the silence at this moment when Trump is asked this question about what would convince him there is no white genocide. And then, you know, the cascade of events leads, because I think Trump is irritated by Ramaphosa's intervention, to the ambush. We then get the famous line, which, you know, is terrifying now. The most terrifying words in the English language. Is Natalie here? And the video goes on, and Trump displays some printouts. Natalie apparently is famous for carrying printouts and photocopies. There's something kind of endearing about the fact the most powerful man in the world, on top of the world's biggest economy, with the most sophisticated technology, and Elon Musk is in the room, for God's sake, all that he can do is show video and computerized printouts. I mean, you know, students at school could do that. But there's something kind of endearing and homespun about this very down-to-earth way in which Trump presents evidence. He doesn't do PowerPoints and graphs and slides and stats and data. It's a bit of video and some photocopy cheats. And this is the most powerful man in the world. But there's something maybe endearing about the homespun nature in which he says he presents his evidence. It is interesting, given the nature of the psychology of the ambush, that he presents the evidence, and for a long time afterwards, it seems that it's been very difficult to find anyone to back up Trump's claims that there's a white genocide. And there's something quite interesting about that. He presents a case in a certain way, not really a big fan of data, generally speaking, and backing up authorities, and then his case seems to disappear when people start looking for it. We see this again and again. There was a famous thing about pets being eaten, I think, by immigrants in one presidential debate. But one of the geniuses about Trump is he understands that when you lay a trap or do an ambush, there's something about the theatricality of the whole exercise, which he is brilliant at, which becomes more important than the content. And maybe that's a deep truth that Trump exposes. So one of the questions, given this is happening again and again, as to why is he doing what he's doing, one of the questions a psychologist or psychiatrist might ask is he addicted to the drama? Because he's very good at creating drama. These ambushes that he springs on people are so dramatic that they grab world headlines in a way that few events in politics can do. Is he addicted to the drama is one key question. There are some other psychological theories which we'll come to in a moment as to what's going on. Is Trump threatened in some sense by these other leaders, which is why he responds so aggressively? Trump has been accused by many clinicians of being a narcissist. Well, there are different kinds of narcissism, actually, if you want to get into this. There is a very interesting subcategory of narcissism called vulnerable narcissism. And the idea here is that the narcissist who loves attention is really covering up a deep insecurity. And he's looking for attention and validation, and he's very boastful. Trump is a very boastful chap. He always talks about great things that he's doing or his administration are doing. One of the questions is this a cover for vulnerable narcissism? Is he insecure? There are lots of theories about the fact that his father may have made him insecure by being quite tough with him. Trump is said wants the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, Cyril Ramaphosa was the right-hand man of Nelson Mandela, who did get, I believe, the Nobel Peace Prize. Is there something threatening about some of these leaders that turn up that leads Trump to spring on them in this way, and maybe has a deep sense of need to cut them down to size? Is that an indication of vulnerable narcissism? Notice how all these world leaders have been discussing at great length with behavioral experts how to handle Trump. They all bring gifts. So Ramaphosa brought a book, which seems, you know, somewhat meager now in comparison to the jet that the Qataris gave Trump. And Ramaphosa ends the consultation, if we can call it that, with Trump or the encounter or the Oval Office ambush with a somewhat rueful, maybe game statement, ruefully gamey type statement, which is he wished he had a plane. I'm paraphrasing. He wished he had a plane to give Trump. Maybe there is no greater sign of a weak economy, which the South African economy is certainly in trouble, partly because maybe of the inadequate leadership of Cyril Ramaphosa. So Trump has a funny kind of way of putting people in their place and getting them to give statements which kind of reveal something about themselves. So there's something quite powerful psychologically about that. So ruefully, Ramaphosa says, I wish we had a plane to give you. He's trying to turn it into a joke, maybe a slightly aggressive joke. It's quite a funny joke. But on the other hand, it's kind of plaintive. I wish we had a plane to give you. You know, we don't have anything. We got the book and we got the 2 world-class golfers. Well, why haven't you got anything? What's wrong with your economy that you haven't got anything to bring? Anyway, I do think that one of the flaws with the way world leaders are handling Trump is this idea you've got to bring him something. Well, let's go with another strategy. 2 other strategies I want to suggest. Don't bring him anything. Turn up with a screw-top bottle of cheap red wine from your local corner shop and hand it to him. And give him some flowers that came from a petrol station. You know, basically, maybe signal that you're not overawed and you're not supplicant, you're not submissive. Give him a cheap and cheerful gift, because that sends a signal, right? The other thing is, people always got this tendency, you could see it with Carney. Carney's strategy was, let me think, Trump was an estate agent. I'll explain it to him like, you know, it's a property deal. Some things are never for sale, like Buckingham Palace and the White House. This is, I'm going to try to be clever. I'm going to try to recognize the guy as being an estate agent, a property developer. I'm going to explain it in property developer terms, which of course is very patronizing. This is, let me explain it to a 5-year-old. And of course, Trump just immediately said, well, never say never, when Carney said some things are never for sale. By the way, it's a very odd statement for a former governor of the Bank of England to make, because actually everything's for sale given the right price. I can assure you the British government would very happily sell Buckingham Palace to the Qataris if it would write off Britain's national debt. And that, by the way, it's entirely possible. They've got the kind of money to do that. So for Carney to say some things are never for sale is a really very economically naive statement. Everything's for sale given the right price. Okay, so I want to make a concluding comment. Can we learn something about how to deal with difficult people? We've seen different strategies being deployed. I believe there are all sorts of other strategies that are going on. Ultimately, you've got to try and think what you're dealing with when you're dealing with a difficult person is Donald Trump. And why are these things happening? Why are these ambushes occurring, which are really kind of completely outside most people's understanding of normal diplomacy, which is like, let's try and make friends. There's something refreshing about Trump's directness, which is, we're not going to be friends, which is a famous line from Margot Robbie in the Wolf of Wall Street. We're not going to be friends. She means it in a different way, of course. But Trump's kind of saying, we're not going to be friends. Let's just be honest, right? Instead of like pretending to be friends and then leaving and then like talking hateful stuff about each other. Everyone does, you know, leaving a dinner party. We're not, Trump's making it clear. Now, Trump made his career, going back to, is he addicted to the drama, from this TV series, The Apprentice. And it ended with a famous catchphrase that became his signature catchphrase. He became famous for it. And it was, "You're fired." There's a very strong sense, I think, in which these press conferences are basically a way of saying that, these Oval Office ambushes. He's basically saying to each of these world leaders, you're not really very good. You're not as good as me, and you're fired, basically. I think world leaders got to think a bit more deeply, but they're being exposed for the inadequate characters they really are as a result of the Trump experience. So like him or loathe him, he produces the unexpected. And the unexpected is always the real test of character, because you can't fall back on learnt scripts. You can't fall back on theatrical scripts that you've learned and practiced with the public relations people. It reveals character. And I believe these Oval Office press conferences are a fantastic learning experience for us to examine and think hard about what's really going on here, because I do believe that character is being revealed at these moments of high tension and drama. Remember that in the psychology of the ambush, from a military standpoint, generally speaking, an ambush is performed by military forces that are inferior to the overarching firepower of the main military force they're up against. So the ambush is like guerrilla warfare, and it's usually practiced by people who don't want to stand up fight. In other words, they're the rebels, they're the guerrilla army, they're the people who are doing hit and run and moving away quickly from the superior forces. It's a bit odd that Donald Trump is adopting the strategy of a guerrilla warfare unit, which is what is the strategy of the ambush. He's the main force. They spend more on military arms and spending than the rest of the world put together, the USA, and they're the world's biggest economy. They are the dominant army on the field. Why is he doing ambushes and this hit and run strategy? It reveals something. It's very interesting psychologically, perhaps, given he's adopted the strategy of the inferior fighting forces, guerrilla warfare, famously promulgated in the Vietnam War, where the North Vietnamese army defeated the Americans, and they had, the Americans had far superior firepower. So this, and they did it by ambushes and hit and run. This was guerrilla warfare. So why is Trump adopting the strategy as normally in a military sense deployed by the weaker military unit or force, not the strategy of the more dominant one? Does it suggest that actually, deep down, Trump doesn't feel he would win in a stand-up fight, and that's why he resorts to these ambushes? So, in other words, the psychology of the ambush is really interesting because it says something maybe about Trump that he is trying to hide from the public, that he doesn't feel that confident about a stand-up fight. And why is that? Why would that be the case? But certainly the ambush and the psychology of the ambush is always, generally speaking, performed by the military force or the tactical force that doesn't feel it would win in a stand-up fight and therefore has to do hit and run and use the element of surprise. The element of surprise is very important and powerful when a weaker adversary is dealing with a stronger one. That's why they use it. So is the psychology of the ambush really revealing something much more deep and intriguing and interesting about what's really going on in the psychology of Trump, which has actually been missed so far, I think, by the rest of the world?